The terrorist attack in Orlando, Florida now has people asking everywhere, could it happen here? We've invited an expert this week. We'll talk to him. Welcome to the Mike Broomhead Show.
Well, I got a message, I got a song. Can I get a witness? Tell me what's going on. I show the people I've been away.
This week, Paul Kinsinger is his name, former member of the CIA. He also works at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. He is a emeritus faculty there and an expert for over 40 years on the Middle East, on terrorism in that part of the world. We've got a great interview with him about what happened in Orlando and the possibilities of it happening right here in Arizona. Broomhead's Best, of course, and hashtag this, but every show starts with something we call the sweep. Donald Trump returns to Phoenix, Arizona. By the time you see this show, Donald Trump will have made an appearance at Phoenix Memorial Coliseum. So we will find out next week on the show what happened during that visit, because you're watching this, we tape it on Thursday. As of Saturday evening, he makes an appearance in town. This after he becomes a presumptive nominee, the first trip back here, but also the statements after the Orlando terrorist attack that had so many people upset, where he said something about a ban on Muslims coming to the country. So we're going to listen to his clarification. Matter of fact, I believe on the radio side, we're covering it live while he's here. So that we'll have an update on next week. In Orlando, Florida, a man named Omar Mateen gunned down 102 people. He murdered 49, wounded 53. And some of the things he did in this attack, first of all, he'd been planning it for a long time. He had been visiting gay bars and gay websites, so everybody thought maybe he's struggling with being gay and how that, with his religion, how that works out being Muslim. But in the end, he makes a 911 call where he swears his allegiance to ISIS, and specifically the leader of ISIS. He said he stood in solidarity with the bombers in Boston. He'd been on the watch list a couple of different times. The FBI had interviewed him twice. Once because co-workers said he was so radicalized. One man that he worked with as a security guard was a police officer and said he was unhinged and unstable. The FBI interviewed him. They didn't find any reason to follow up. There's no evidence that led them down a path that this guy was a terrorist. A couple of years later, he once again showed up on the FBI's radar because he had a relationship, or at least a connection to, what turned out to be an American-born suicide bomber in Syria. But they deemed that not to be much of a connection, so once again, he wasn't on any list. So that's kind of a background on Omar Mateen and who he was. Now, we know I told you about the gay bars and everything else, but he was married. He had children, married twice. No charges as of the taping of this show against his wife. She was, again, I don't know how you don't charge this woman. She faces charges of 49 counts of accessory to murder, 53 counts of accessory to attempted murder, failing to report a terrorist attack, lying to federal agents, and at last we heard she hadn't been arrested. She went with him when he was surveilling the gay bar. She went with him when he was buying ammunition. She told federal agents, she asked him not to do it, but she never reported it. He gunned down 102 people. She knew it was going to happen, and she did nothing, and yet she isn't in a jail cell. I don't understand American justice sometimes. This seems to me to be an open and shut case against this woman. We'll see in the coming days what happens. President Obama, immediately after the attacks, in his first statement to the American people, started talking about gun control. Now, Democratic senators this week, 15-hour filibuster on the Senate floor, demanding what they said was common sense gun control laws. Well, President Obama made a couple of statements that I want to point out. First of all, I sat in my studio on the radio side and watched the president give a speech, and he gave what I thought to be one of the most eloquent defenses of the First Amendment I'd ever heard. He criticized Donald Trump, and he didn't call him by name, but he said the presumptive nominee, and he criticized Donald Trump and the idea of banning all Muslims coming into America. And then he pointed out where these last groups of terrorists here in America, they were all born here. They were Muslim, but born here. I want you to hear how eloquent the president is talking about no religious test and how American we are for having our First Amendment. Watch this.
The Orlando killer, one of the San Bernardino killers, the Fort Hood killer, they were all U.S. citizens. Are we going to start treating all Muslim Americans differently? Are we going to start subjecting them to special surveillance? Are we going to start discriminating against them because of their faith?
There you have it. So he's right. The First Amendment makes sure we can't do any of that. And I thought, good for you, Mr. President, the first time I've ever agreed with you. Then he starts talking about the Second Amendment. Then he starts talking about the right to keep and bear arms. Now I want you to hear how he does a 180-degree turn when it comes to the Second Amendment. Watch this.
Reinstate the assault weapons ban. Make it harder for terrorists to use these weapons to kill us. Otherwise, despite extraordinary efforts across our government, by local law enforcement, by our intelligence agencies, by our military, despite all the sacrifices that folks make, these kinds of events are going to keep on happening. And the weapons are only going to get more powerful.
So, the First Amendment, the Founding Fathers were brilliant. We don't have a religious test. We do not take a group of people based on their faith and punish them or scrutinize them or surveil them because of the actions of a few. It's un-American and it's against the First Amendment. But when it comes to the Second Amendment, we can ban guns, we can surveil, we can have extra scrutiny on people that would own and buy guns. That's American. No, it's not. The Second Amendment is every bit as protective as the First Amendment. And just like banning Muslims won't stop terrorist attacks, neither will banning guns. You have to look at the people that committed the act. It is the most ridiculous contradiction for the president to be so eloquent about the First Amendment and then be so completely opposite when it comes to the Second Amendment. Banning guns doesn't solve this problem. Not one chance. In a moment, Paul Kinsinger joins me. He is an expert on terrorism. He joins me next. Stick around. We've known now a terrorist attack in Orlando, Florida. Now we're all wondering, could it happen here? What can we do to prevent it or at least limit it? So we've asked intelligence expert, former member of the CIA, intelligence analyst, and emeritus faculty at Thunderbird Global Management School, Paul Kinsinger. Thank you.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
So first, let me ask you out of the gate, when something like this happens, based on your experience, do you view this differently than someone like myself would? I mean, how do you view it differently?
Well, I might view it differently only because I've spent 45 years looking at the Middle East, trying to understand the region and have my head in global politics and so on and so forth. So I have a level of experience that's different than the average American in that sense. So it gives me a little different context, gives me a little more depth to work with. That's the difference.
So when you look at the Islamic State, which, and without trying to criticize too much, the president saying a short time ago that they were the JV squad, but now we know they're earning tens of millions of dollars a month and they've grown into such a big force. What makes them different from maybe some of the other groups you followed and you've studied over the years?
Well, I think the thing that made ISIS different was that they grew up in a zone where there was no government control. It basically took advantage of the vacuum of power in most of Syria and in a big chunk of Iraq, as the governments in Damascus and Baghdad have either given up on huge chunks of territory that used to constitute Syria or are contesting those territories in Iraq. This created a vacuum of power and an opportunity for a bunch of Sunnis who were disaffected in the Middle East to really step in and create a state. I think, however, though, everything I'm reading suggests to me that they're on the decline right now. They're losing territory. They're losing leaders right and left. Their financial situation is being diminished. And this is a bunch that hit high point probably a year ago and are on the decline now. It's going to take a while yet because, frankly, it's not in the interest of the Bashar al-Assad government in Syria to go after these guys. They're not the main problem for them. The main problem for them is in the western and northwestern parts of the country that are the key to their success. It's not the rest of the country. So right now, that's not an issue for them. Let the West and everybody else worry about these guys. In Iraq, we have a similar problem that the Sunni chunk of the central part of the country is not what the government's most concerned about. The government is headed by a Shia group. That's about 43% of the population. Their main concern is the south and the central part of the country. They don't want to go. This is like trying to play on the other end of the field when you're still trying to learn offense on your field.
Okay.
So this is the challenge we have with ISIS. However, I think ISIS is headed downhill now, and that gradually it's going to get taken care of. That's not going to affect materially its ability to use disaffected Muslims in the West or others to carry out lone wolf attacks like we saw in Orlando.
And that was my next question, because I had Senator McCain on the radio show, and he said we've got two choices. We can kill them there, or we can kill them here. That these lone wolf attacks, whether it's a direct order or it's sympathizers or following orders, is there a connection with us being able to disassemble them where they are in Iraq and Syria, and these lone wolf attacks diminishing here because they really don't have people to follow anymore?
I think that's, we could hope for that connection. I think it's tenuous, however. We don't even know that these guys were operating under any central ISIS instructions, or whether they just decided, hey, this is my chance. I've been sitting around for years being disaffected, I'm angry, I'm whatever, and now I got something I can wear as a badge and go out there and say I did this for this. We don't even know that that's the case yet. So as long as you have people operating, as maybe in San Bernardino and maybe in Orlando now, from their own mindset, it's a convenient thing to say, we did this for ISIS. No, maybe ISIS, has got some plants, so on and so forth. I'm sure they've been trying. But it's going to be very difficult for us to cut off these lone wolf things, especially because they are lone wolf. If ISIS had a large organization in this country, we could go after it. We can go after it in the Middle East, and we are, and so are a bunch of others, and we will diminish it there. But there could be significant lag effect over time as to whether we can stop the lone wolf stuff where people are just copycatting.
Well, it's for a layman to say he's been investigated twice. Co-workers, a police officer he worked with said he was unhinged and unstable. There was really no cause for arrest, and on to the next case. 10,000 leads come in all the time to the FBI. Yeah. What then would constitute enough of a threat or enough for them to follow more closely that he jumped from on a list to not getting a security clearance and then committing this kind of murder?
No, and this is, as we were talking about in the break, this is part of the complexity of these kinds of issues. There are literally thousands of people who fit in one form or another a potential characteristic that's being watched. But, we have, first off, you have a process situation, you have a manpower situation, how many people can be followed up on a regular basis and be kept under watch. This has been tried in the past. It was called East Germany, where every other person was watching somebody else. It was a total police state, and it didn't work. The country still fell. So that's one thing. The second thing is that, we're going to refine the abilities we have here, and smart data, tracking devices, so on and so forth, give us the abilities we have now that we didn't have 2 decades ago. So we're going to get better and better at this. Nonetheless, this will remain forever a needle in a haystack situation, and there will always be these things. Who saw Timothy McVeigh?
Right. 20
years ago. Right. Who saw this guy? Soldier, served his country, blah, blah, blah. Who saw him blow up a federal building? No one.
So then the question is it preventable? What can we do to diminish the possibilities of that? So I'm going to take a quick break. When we get back, I'm going to ask Mr. Kinsinger those questions about what happens here in Arizona. Are we safe? Is it safe here still in the United States? And what can we do to diminish the possibilities of that here? We'll be back in a moment. All right, global war on terror, terrorism here in America, lone wolf attacks, or is it organized through the Islamic State? And we have the Middle Eastern expert, former intelligence analyst with the CIA, Paul Kinsinger. And while we were talking during the break about are we safe here, I told you a story personally when I was out with my grandkids, and for the first time I wondered, what would I do if something happened in this place? And I think a lot of people ask themselves that now. What kind of danger is there really for the average person here in Arizona?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mike, and I think to the point here. I think, frankly, most of us are as safe as we have ever been. A state like Arizona is not going to be attracting these kinds of things. We don't have a Disney World. We don't have a Grand Central Station. We don't have the nation's capital. We don't have the Golden Gate Bridge. We don't have any of these kinds of things that would attract a high-profile attack. You could still have a lone wolf thing here going off anywhere, but you know, you could get killed in an automobile accident in this city. Does that keep people from driving? I don't think so, not according to the traffic I see out there. You could go down in a plane, not very likely anymore, but does that keep people from flying? No, and this kind of thing should not keep people from going about their daily lives. What would I say you should do? Well, in general, I don't change the way I think about security and personal security because of the age of terrorism. I am always try to be aware of where I am and the situation around me. Situational awareness is the issue. And I think for many of us, that's about, you know, as you said in the break, are you looking around? Do you understand where points of exit are? Do you understand where there might be a jam up of people? Do you understand who's around you when you're walking on a street in a city you don't understand very well? Are you paying attention to traffic in a different part of the world? Do you get custom and culture in different places? Are you paying attention to things? Are you just being a goof who's not paying attention to anything? And you know, frankly, I look at Americans in many places and I wonder, are you very situationally aware or are you just walking along?
Well, you mentioned before we don't have a lot of the what would be attracted to some of these attacks, but we do have the Hoover Dam and the Palo Verde nuclear plant. But facilities like that have such plans in place where if it would be so difficult to have an attack against them.
Right.
You know, Luke Air Force Base. You know,
these are harder targets. You know, what we've been facing in San Bernardino and in Orlando are really soft targets. These are not places that, you know, have security issues. Would be hard targets, the ones you've just talked about. So it's a different thing. I mean, if you're a business owner and you think that you're potentially a target of attack, or you know you want to take into account additional liability, then you can beef up security measures. You have that opportunity. But should everybody be doing that? No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Do you want to live in a police state mentality? I don't think that's this country.
So we can't prevent them. We know that that's impossible, but it's unlikely. So then what's the answer? Is there a way to defeat this? You've been following this for 40 years in that part of the world. What's the answer so that we can, for the most part, people aren't getting so radicalized that they think shooting 102 people is a viable thing to do? Right.
I think the answer is really at two stages, Mike, and I would say, so let's stay at the personal stage and the country stage first off, and that is that I think in any community, it is up to family, it's at the start a family issue, it's up to families to be able to have, they're the ones who are going to have the most influence on family members, and we need the communities here, the Muslim communities and others, to feel as if they are enough part of this country and culture to want to protect it. And many do. I'll bet you that if we could poll the thousands of Muslims in this country, the vast majority would fit just the exact pattern I said. And so it's about, it starts with the families, I think, of young Muslims, young Muslim males in particular, to work with these guys and their communities and their religious centers, to work with these guys in a positive way to keep them focused. Now, we have a much better chance of that in the United States, frankly, than they do in Western Europe, in Europe in general, where Muslim communities are largely isolated and have been for decades. And this is a huge problem in places like Brussels, in France, not as much in the UK, in Germany and elsewhere, where Muslim communities don't have anywhere near the buy-in that they do in this country. So we're lucky in that aspect. I think to the larger question, there is a sea change that must occur in the Islamic world and in the Arab world in particular. There's 1.6 billion Muslims around the world. There are about 400 million of them in the Arab world. If you start with that alone, the Arab world is behind the rest of the world in almost everything. And they need to catch up. There's millions of young people in the Arab world who want the kind of opportunity that is available to Asia, to the West, to South Asia, to the Americas, and so on and so forth. They want these opportunities. And they're the best weapon we really have with that population is the continued ability to demonstrate that there's opportunity available to young, smart people all over the world. And we're a beacon for that in the United States. The more we can put out what economic opportunity looks like, what social opportunity looks like, and the use of mass social media tools. The more we have the possibility of really pushing this part of the world forward and changing the old guard over there. We saw it briefly in Arab Spring in 2010, 11, 12. That's not the end of it. That's the start of it.
Okay. We appreciate the time and for your service, all your years of service in the country. That, you know, the intelligence gathering world is so important, so we appreciate it, and thank you so much for coming.
You bet. My pleasure.
Thank you. We'll be back in a moment. One more thing to add to the list of why I love Arizona, it's this week's Broomhead's Best. Slide Rock in Sedona was named one of the 10 best swimming holes in the entire country. Now, this list is put together by the Travel Channel. It describes the natural water park like no other. If you've ever been up to Oak Creek Canyon, which is one of my favorite places to go in Sedona, it is gorgeous. Nice to see that something in Arizona is getting recognized, and Slide Rock sure deserves it. Now, what's burning up the internet? It's for Father's Day this week. We call it #this. We're calling it #BeerBear. Watch this. Golf course in Alaska. You know the wildlife in Alaska is all over the place. You golf in places in Arizona, you might see a coyote or a bobcat on the golf course. Well, in Alaska, it's bears. And what do the bears do while they're there? They steal your beer off the golf cart. So when you're drunk out with Dad on the golf course here, you look for rattlesnakes, you make sure the birds don't eat your snacks. In Alaska, they make sure that the bears don't steal your beer. I don't know. I think I'd rather golf in Arizona, thanks.
Hey, that's my beer. Get out of here.
In just a moment, we're going to close out the show. And by the way, if you're a social media user, you can find us on all the social media platforms. Look for us there. We'll be back here in just a minute. I sat shocked this week with watching people bend over backwards to figure out a way to infringe people's rights in this country. We talk about the First Amendment, as I said earlier in the show, and the president and how thoughtful he was in saying we don't have a religious test. It's un-American. That's what the First Amendment says. But the Second Amendment also guarantees our rights to keep and bear arms. This is not about someone like myself that would rather have guns than a safe society. An unarmed society is not safe. I'll give you an example. The gun laws in Paris preclude those exact rifles, they call assault rifles, that did all that damage in that nightclub. But guess what? That assault rifle that did the damage in the nightclub, that's what the cops used to kill the bad guy and save the other lives in that club. So it's an assault rifle in the hands of a terrorist. What is it in the hands of a police officer? By the way, in Paris, during the Charlie Hebdo attacks, did you see the videotape? Because the cops aren't armed much of the time in Paris. That those guys, the terrorists, murdered a cop on the street because he was unarmed. They were shooting at a police car that was driving away. Guess what? Assault rifles are banned in Paris. You can ban rifles if you want to. You know what that means? Someone like myself can't have one. I'm not dangerous if I own one. You know who's dangerous? The terrorists. He wasn't on a watch list. They took him off. He got a gun and passed a background check to get a government clearance. That's where you look for the problem. You don't say to the rest of society, we're going to make it harder for you because a few people are idiots. That's not American either. If the First Amendment protects rights and that makes us Americans, so does the Second Amendment. Let's address the problem and not fight over these impassioned, emotional issues, because we're going to fix this by banning guns, and it's not going to solve the problem. I'll be back next week. Thanks for joining us. God bless.
Get more of Mike Broomhead on Facebook, Twitter, and of course weekday mornings from 6 to 10 on News Talk 550 KFYI.